1862, the Pacific Railway Act was passed, providing for the first transcontinental railroad. The railroad would stretch all the way from Omaha, Nebraska to California. The Central Pacific Railroad Company would start in California and build eastward, and the Union Pacific Company started in Omaha and built westward. This transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869 when the two lines met in Promontory, Utah, where a ceremonial gold railroad spike was hammered in. The completion of the railroad would forever change the culture of the United States. How did the Union Pacific Central Pacific Railroad impact the culture of the United States between 1862 and 1900? Constructing rail lines was brutal, labor-intensive work, and the railroad company was hard-pressed to find workers willing and able to do the work. At first, Irish workers were mainly employed, but even the Irish, who were desperate for work, did not form a stable enough workforce. The railroad companies were then forced to employ Chinese immigrants, who were the most despised immigrants of all. The Central Pacific Line in particular relied heavily upon the Chinese laborers, even sending out advertisements to China to get more employees. This was a change in work culture, as very few Chinese laborers were hired prior to the railroads, and were generally discouraged from immigrating to the United States in general. As construction continued, small towns known as hell towns popped up near the railroad lines. These towns began to shape the West. Approximately 7,000 towns across the United States began as hell towns or Union Pacific depots or water stops. But as people began moving westward, these towns were not the only places where people settled. The railroads made westward travel cheaper, faster, and more reliable, and as a consequence, more towns were set up across various points in the West. In particular, people began moving to California in earnest, and the state became a major economic and political force in the country. The railroad was also responsible for the creation of time zones. In order to keep trains on schedule and inform passengers of arrival and departure times, standard time zones were created. This image shows time zones in 1883. But not everything the railroad did was positive. In 1872, the Credit Mobilier scandal was exposed. Several members of the U.S. government bought a company they called the Credit Mobilier of America. These people then illegally manipulated contracts, reaping enormous profits but impoverishing the railroad in the process. The culture of the railroad is corrupt in other ways too. The railroads inspired a culture where business tycoons known as robber barons thrived. The government did little to nothing to curb the monopoly of the railroad and surrounding businesses, and as a result, the men in charge became incredibly rich, and then were able to discriminate against the common people. For instance, small farmers were forced to pay the highest rates for railroad transportation, while big companies cut deals with the railroads and got low rates. Overall, the Transcontinental Railroad brought change to the culture of the United States, both good and bad. The West was opened up to trade and settlement on a much larger scale. New immigrants were brought in, time zones were created, and monopolistic practices began in earnest. All these things formed the changes in culture due to the railroad from 1862 to 1900.